Welcome to Scoolinary, the online cooking school that transforms people and connects cultures. You will learn with the best chefs in the industry, and you will discover the broadest online catalog of topics related to gastronomy. We publish new courses every week. In our podcast, we have coffee with a chef every week. Each of them will tell us about their experience and their vision for the culinary world to help you better understand this exciting industry. Come on, join us for coffee. Today we have Paul Newnham joining us for coffee. Paul is a global leader in sustainable food systems and is the director of the Chefs Manifesto. He has been instrumental in mobilizing chefs to use their culinary influence and platform to promote positive change. Through the Chefs Manifesto, he and his team are fostering a global movement of chefs who are committed to transforming the food system to be more sustainable, equitable, and healthy for both people and the planet. Hi, Paul. Welcome. Thanks very much for joining us for coffee.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Before we begin, a question we ask all our guests is, are you a coffee drinker?
I love coffee. So I'm one of those people that will have upwards of 8 or 10 cups of coffee a day, and it doesn't really keep me awake. It doesn't affect me in a negative way. So I love coffee and have an espresso machine at home and live in a very coffee centric city as well. So I'm from Melbourne, Australia, which is well known for coffee around the world.
How do you usually take your coffee?
I start, my first coffee of the day is with oat milk. It's an oat milk cappuccino normally, and then I reduce dramatically. It gets down to short, espressos or long blacks or Americanos, depending on what part of the world you're in, as the day gets going. So I like it shorter and stronger as the day goes on.
Very good. Please, if you would, tell us in your own words who you are and where you're from. That's so that our listeners can have a chance to get to know you a little better.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, my name's Paul Newnham. I am Executive Director at the Sustainable Development Goal 2 Advocacy Hub, which runs a group called the Chefs Manifesto. I'm from Australia, lived all over the world since a very young age. So lived and worked all over the world in most continents. And I love food. And now I'm privileged to work with chefs around the world around the areas of sustainability, and also work with the United Nations and other businesses and companies around sustainability. And so one of the things we do is run a project called the Chefs Manifesto, which is a chef-led project that brings together over 1,000 chefs from around the world. And basically together they explore how they can deliver sustainable food system. And so we work with chefs to help bridge the gap between farm and fork and empower them with a framework which connects to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals is a platform that was signed on to by every country in the world in the year 2015 as an agenda for driving forward sustainable development. And we help work with chefs to actually show the part they can play. And so we've developed a framework which consists of simple, practical actions chefs can take that are grouped into 8 thematic areas.
Can you tell us who are some of the chefs that are working toward the Sustainable Development Goals through their actions?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we have over 1,100 chefs from around the world in almost 100 countries. And so there's quite a few. So it's always challenging when you get asked to name chefs because you're always going to leave someone out. So we believe very strongly in chefs come in all different shapes and sizes, work in all different parts of the food system, from food development right through to fine dining, from fine dining through to school canteens, and we have everything in between. Some of the chefs that have been involved in that, just coming to mind, Sammy Mansour from the US, Christina Baumann from Italy, Connor Spacey from Ireland, Mary Sue Milliken from LA. We've got Palmiro Ocampo from Peru. We've got Arthur Potts Dawson in the UK, Chantel Nicholson in the UK. We've got Camilla Sidler over in Copenhagen. We've got Ali Mandri in Kenya. We've got Coco is based out of South Africa. There's lots and lots of chefs that we have. Dennis Prescott in Canada, Lorna Maseko in South Africa. So many different chefs in so many different parts of the world doing a lot. And so, they all do things in their own way, in their own regions, in the spaces that they're in. And that has impact in those ecosystems that they live in. And I think that's one of the key things we love about the Chefs Manifesto is it enables chefs. It's about empowering chefs to do the things that they're potentially already doing, but to connect that into this bigger ecosystem and to be able to then connect with other chefs and learn from them and also teach them a little bit about how to kind of accelerate change and drive forward sustainability through the everyday actions they take in their kitchens.
That is a great lead into the next question, which is the current Chefs Manifesto the organization you had in mind when you started?
So when we started this, we were looking at so I work a lot across food sustainability, and we were looking at the fact that when you see lots of food sustainability meetings, often there's scientists there, there's policymakers, and often we're talking about food, but we forget to have the people in the room that are actually working on food. And we looked at that end to end, and often, food starts in the farm, and so farmers are key for any food conversation. But then those ingredients that come from the farm end up going through a distribution process and they end up in a kitchen somewhere. And chefs tend to be the connector between the farm and then the fork or the eater. And so they help to be able to connect dots. And we have chefs in so many parts of our lives. When we go to restaurants, we see chefs. When we turn on our television, when we pull out our phone. And so chefs are these amazing connectors, and there are these amazing influencers. And so what we really originally started out to do was to start a conversation for how do we get chefs engaged in sustainability. What we found was there were already lots of chefs already very active involved in sustainability. But what happened was different chefs were working on different components. Some were working on food waste, others were working on seasonality, others were working on livelihoods, others were working on biodiversity. There was all these different elements, and all of them were really important. But when you spoke to one chef, they would sometimes say, oh, I think you should all care about this, or I think you should all care about this. But when you look at sustainable development, you realize that things are actually interconnected. And so when we do that, we have to have a conversation where people are joined up. And so this is really key. And so as we've kind of continued, what we've done is this organization is built into a relationship network of chefs that are all learning from one another. And one of the things I've learned the most from this is to see the power, culture, and place play in learning. And so as you look at another culture or you look at another place, you're able to often then see some of the things that you're doing well, but also some of the things you need to do more on. And I think as we bring a global network together, that enables that interchange to respect and learn from one another, but also to learn and teach one another. And it's a mutuality, it's a mutual connection where there's no one right or one wrong answer, but we all have something to offer. And I think that in the kitchen, this becomes really, really interesting as we learn about food.
You've mentioned hunger a lot, quite prominently in some previous interviews and some things that you've spoken about. And I believe ending hunger is number 2
Yeah.
of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the topic of hunger is a complicated one to talk about. However, it sounds like you've managed to engage people in talking about hunger without guilt tripping, shocking, or provoking a reaction. And I'd like to know, how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, so in Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them. Goal 2 is titled Zero Hunger, but it's actually more than just ending hunger. It's also about providing the right nutrition, ensuring that farmers' livelihoods are looked after, having biodiversity, making sure that we also look after the environment. And so there's all of these elements. And when you realize, I mean, and you look at a system, and this is any system, and it could also be any recipe, you can look at this in different ways. You put different ingredients in to get to where you want to be. It's the same in systems. There's lots of things that impact them. And so when we talk about hunger, we've also got to talk about what are the elements which lead to that. And there's all different types of hunger. And that looks very different depending on where you go. And so what we've tried to do is to also talk about the opposite of what hunger is. So when you talk about zero hunger, it's a zero and it's hunger. They're both kind of almost negative. It's like nothing and whereas when we talk a lot about good food for all, which is talking about food that's good, that helps people, but for everyone, and then an equity element. And so we've tried to flip some of these conversations where when you talk about an issue like zero hunger, it can get quite depressing and people can feel guilty. But what we've tried to do is actually flip that and actually say, how do we actually look at some of what it would look like if there was no hunger in the world? How would that look? And when you talk to people who are hungry, they always can tell you what they would love to eat, because food is something that connects us all. It's something that brings joy to us. And some people have too much or not enough or too little or not at the right time. Like there's so many dynamics in our world. But, the idea of having some sort of good food for everyone that does good, that it tastes good, that is good, is really key. And people say, well, how can you define what good food is? And it's hard because what is good food for you and what you like to eat versus what I like to eat is different because we are different. And we've got to celebrate that in our food system. So as we look at the idea of hunger, we also look at what the opposite of that is. And we've been able to bring people together around those kinds of ideas.
Given your tendency toward positivity, I was wondering if your game, how would you put a positive spin on these terms? And what I'll do is I'll just fire off a term and you tell me how you would approach that. Food inequality,
Everyone having access,
war,
peace,
famine,
plenty,
waste.
value.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned just a minute ago was the Good Food for All. And one of your current projects is Good Food for All 2030. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so we have really tried to build out kind of a narrative around how we can work towards good food for all, and this has been built into the UN Food System Summit, which happened a couple of years ago, and so it was adopted by the UN as a kind of narrative to really talk about the food system and to talk a little bit about how do we bring together this idea of driving good food for all. And people kind of start with, they say, well, what does good mean? And as I mentioned, it's this interesting question because it enables us to then talk about, good food is nutritious. It begins with the farmer. You can start to then kind of open up a narrative around food. And I think one of the big challenges we face is that people don't think enough about their food. They don't think about where the ingredients come from. They don't think about what it does. They just kind of see food and they expect it there. And so what we really want to do is trying to kind of think about more, how do we open up people's imagination around food to then actually be able to drive forward food. And so that's something that we're trying to kind of drive. And so Good Food for All is a kind of common platform for people to then gather around that area.
I caught in your bio that you attended the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and I wanted to know, what was your area of study?
So I studied public narrative there. So how do you help to create narratives which enable a connection to people? And so it was like, how do you think about the communication styles to engage people from a leadership perspective? And this is something we've done quite a lot of. So it was super helpful to understand what some of the best public narratives have been and how you can utilize a narrative to engage people. And I think this is something that's really important. It can be used badly and it can also be used for good. And so we've really tried hard to think a lot about where we want to go and how do you engage the public in that conversation.
Government institutions, they can also contribute to challenges of food scarcity and consequently hunger for their nations. How can we, citizens of the world, help influence change in nations that experience these challenges?
Yeah, look, I think there's lots of different situations around this. We're running some campaigns at the moment which are really looking at financing and financing mechanisms for people to look at climate adaptation, to look at how agriculture is shifting and what it's focused around. Obviously, there's also then on the nutritional side looking at how do we get people diversified diets. So thinking about really prioritizing nutritionally dense foods, making them more affordable and accessible. I think in the absence of that, it's looking at food fortification, safety nets, and things like that on staple grains, so that you can be helping people to get the basic nutrients, similar to what we've done with salt in many parts of the world, where we've iodized it, and little simple things which have been able to actually make a big difference for people who are not getting that kind of complete diet. So, I mean, when I think about if there was one thing that people could do, is really look at advocating for more diversified diets. So helping people to think about different ingredients that they can utilize that are more nutrient dense. We've got a campaign at the moment around beans, peas, and lentils, for example, which are, a food which has a lot of going for it in terms of soluble fiber, proteins, micro and macronutrients, but also is very good for the soil. It's very climate friendly in that regard, and it's also very affordable. And there's lots of things like that we should be advocating into diets and getting people. So seaweed's another. There's so many different ingredients out there. Millets is another that's been. This is the International Year of Millets, and most people have never even heard of millets, or they don't know what you're talking about. And then you kind of talk about amaranth and all these different things, and they go, "Oh, okay, I know that." But getting more of these kinds of diverse foods into diets, I think, is absolutely critical, and working with governments to actually think about the way they do that. That can be through subsidies, through different programs that they have, but ensuring that they're also thinking about that diversified diets.
Now, on the flip side of that, there is the risk of exploiting some of those natural resources. I think of quinoa as one of those. How do we avoid that?
Yeah, I think this is I think the big challenge with things like that is that you've got to look at not just picking one hero grain, for example. You've got to pick a family. So when we talk about beans, peas, and lentils, there's literally thousands of varieties. So you've got to look at diversification. You can't have a one size fits all in the food system. You've got to look at diversification. So you don't just start down one. If you look at millets, there's many different types of millets. They grow at different altitudes. They grow in different parts of the world. They grow with different amounts of water. The same in beans. The same in seaweeds can grow anywhere. So I think we've got to pick crops that are kind on water use. They're good for the soil. They have high nutritional density. They're also accessible and affordable. And when you have that conversation, there's lots of kind of myths around the quinoa conversation as well. When you talk to some people in Bolivia, they say, well, actually, we really appreciate the fact that people are buying our quinoa because now we can buy other things that we want, And so there's like this kind of conversation goes backwards and forwards about our food system, and it becomes very easy for then people to say, oh, well, we shouldn't do that, or we should do that. And the reality is there's directions of travel that I think as a sector we've gone down, which is we've come to fewer, more concentrated ingredients in our diets, to the point that we get 60% of our calories from 4 to 5 different ingredients around the world. Whereas we need to be going the opposite way to more diversified diets, which are more contextually relevant, diversified around the world, depending on areas and regions that you live in.
Now, what would you like the global food system to be like in the near future? In other words, if you could design it, how would that be?
So I would say it's a system that's accessible and affordable for all, so that there is some level of diversity, enjoyment. I would say one thing we often talk about when we talk about food is we talk a lot about what it does for people. So people get into the science of it, everyone having enough and having the right nutrients. But I also think it's also a major part of enjoyment, what brings our culture out. Often religion is very connected to food. So I would say it's a system which is diverse, which is sustainable, if not giving back. So like it needs to be not just sustaining at the level it's in, but also regenerative. And so that means kind of capturing carbon into the soil, increasing the biodiversity, enabling that kind of ecosystem to occur. And that the people that work in it actually can make a livelihood that actually enables them to have the right kind of life as well. And so to me, it's kind of thinking about it in that kind of holistic view.
Now, last question I have for you is who would you recommend for a future edition of this podcast? Someone related to the world of gastronomy. And I know you have a huge list of people. So let's hear them.
Yeah, there's so many people. I mean, I've got so many friends who are chefs. There's a friend of mine that Mitchell Davis, who is based out of New York. He works around the world in food. He cooks and he actually runs his own podcast as well. But Mitchell is an encyclopedia of food. He understands so much about so many different. So on Instagram, he's Kitchen Sense, and so you can check him out. But he understands different cultures, different ingredients, the way they come together. He's worked a long time with restaurants around the world, in all kinds of ways, and is very passionate about sustainability and the whole world of food.
Awesome. Well, Paul, thank you very much for joining us for coffee today. And with that, I wish you a great rest of the day. If you like this episode, don't miss an episode by becoming a member. We're waiting for you each week with more guests. We're on all podcast platforms. Just search for Coffee with Scoolinary. We're also waiting for you at our website and on our social networks, where you can get to know all our courses and teachers.